A lot of people think that in the days of the colonialists, Africans did nothing to resist them occupying their country. When in actual fact, it took the colonialists hundreds of years to penetrate Africa because of the hard resistance and wars to fend them off and to defend their nations and kingdoms. And one of those stories is the story of Njinga. Queen Njinga fought blood, tooth, and nail to defend her people. Queen Njinga's reign was sometime in the early 17th century. She was unfortunately born and raised at a time when there were constant attacks from Portuguese colonialists. Her country, Ndongo, which is now known as Angola, was constantly under attack and constantly at war. Njinga and her people were practically born running from extinction. Njinga's father at the time was the king, and even though he had two sons, she was clearly his favorite. He saw himself in her great strength, passion, strong character, diplomatic nature, and strategic thinking. So he allowed her to learn how to fight and train with his army. He also took his time to groom her for leadership, and he allowed her to sit in court with him from an early age. Njinga's father was troubled by the constant conflict with the Portuguese. There was also some internal intertribal conflict by other lords who wished to usurp him. The Portuguese took advantage of this internal struggle to penetrate further, and at last the king was betrayed by his own people and murdered. When her father died, chaos reigned. There was no clear line of succession from the king, so her eldest brother Mbande seized the reins of power, and he ensued in a terrible bloodbath of internal genealogical cleansing. He wiped out his father's entire bloodline. He murdered his own brother, who was probably the rightful heir, and he even murdered children. One of the casualties was his own sister, Njinga's child. And that wasn't the worst thing. The worst thing was that after her own brother had killed her only son, she was expected to still work with him because she was still a part of royalty and of the bloodline of the ancestors. He had also made sure that Njinga and her sisters were sterilized so that they would never ever have children who might be one day a threat to him. You see, her brother Mbande was actually her half-brother, and even though he had been the firstborn child, his mother had not been legitimately married to the king, so he always felt that his position was threatened, and he was power-hungry. After his bloodbath, he was crowned the king. Njinga worked with her brother for a while, but then she decided to leave the kingdom on a kind of self-imposed exile. She teamed up with an opposing warring lord faction against her brother's wishes. She formed an alliance with them and fought with them to fend off the Portuguese. Njinga had been born into an era of bloodshed and darkness, and she lived and breathed to get the Portuguese off their necks. Over the course of the years, the pressure grew worse and worse for the new king Mbande. The Portuguese encroached further and further until they took over the capital city where his palace was, and he was forced to flee. He fled to the Kidongo Islands, where he summoned Njinga and fell to his knees, pleading with her and begging her for forgiveness and to come back and help him. She eventually agreed. He couldn't deny her natural flair for leadership and diplomacy, and she was also highly respected by the people. He felt that she was the one who could create the alliance with the Portuguese, so he made her the ambassador to the Portuguese. So for the next few months, Queen Njinga began to embark on a series of visits to the Portuguese camp in order to broker some sort of alliance and peace treaty with them. Now, seeing that she was a woman, the Portuguese tried to manipulate and humiliate her on her first visit, and they asked her to sit on the floor. Njinga refused to be intimidated, and in a power move, she asked one of her servants to bend down, and she sat on him and faced the Portuguese captain. She did this to show that she was their equal. And the next time that she came for a meeting, they offered her a chair instead. Njinga was tough and firm, and she made it clear that her people were not slaves and up for sale or negotiation. They began to respect and even fear her. Njinga became friends with one of the top Portuguese officials' wives, and she started to learn a lot from her. She learned that the Portuguese took their religion, Christianity, very seriously, and that if they converted to Christianity, the Portuguese would begin to see them as equals. And so Njinga was pressured into converting to Christianity. She was baptized and taught Christianity, and a peace treaty was made finally with the Portuguese. They formed an alliance, and the Portuguese even went a step further to promise to protect them from the warring factions that threatened their kingdom. They also released the slaves that they had captured. And when Njinga returned back to the capital, she received a hero's welcome from her brother and the people. She had become a beacon of light for the Ndongo people. Unfortunately, this new alliance was not to last for long. A few months later, the Portuguese began their slave trade raids again. They seemed to have an insatiable lust for manpower, and they never seemed to have enough. They always wanted more. So Queen Njinga started to fight them again, and this time she was very ruthless. She gathered her army and attacked them and fought them off. And she began to attack slave routes. She shut down and blocked off many of their slave trade routes. The Portuguese found out that their slave trade could no longer prosper, and they became furious and very frustrated. While the wars were going on, King Mbade had felt immense pressure to also convert to Christianity, and he did. Despite this, the Portuguese continued raiding them. This treachery was a huge blow to Mbade, as conversion to Christianity was seen as a huge sign of weakness and a deviation and betrayal of the ancestors. His people lost faith in him, and he began to be seen as a very weak king. He fell into a very deep depression, and eventually he committed suicide. It seemed like all his evil doings had finally caught up with him. Queen Njinga took the reins to the kingdom and eventually was crowned queen. In order to secure her people and keep the peace, Queen Njinga eventually succumbed fully to Christianity, and she opened up many churches within her community, and most of her people converted as well. They began acting and living as Christians. Over a 10-year period she did this, and she also sent envoys and missionaries to the Pope himself. She wanted the Pope to recognize her and declare her as the rightful queen of Ndongo Kingdom. She knew that this was what would grant her and her people ultimate peace, their freedom. She sent incessant letters to the Pope over the years, and eventually she received the letter that she had long awaited. The Pope had finally acceded. He granted her autonomy. He officially recognized her as the queen. She was recognized as the legitimate Christian ruler of the Ndongo Kingdom, the peace she had fought for so many decades. Her people would finally have peace for years to come. The war was over. Queen Njinga had finally succeeded in securing the land of her ancestors, as was expected of her.